Hello and welcome to the lecture presentation for week 13 of this course. This is actually the last week of material before the final exam. And some of this material might sound like ground we've covered in different contexts before, but I think it's worth going over specifically the idea of surveillance in the context of the internet. We've talked about surveillance and gender and a little bit on surveillance and class and the idea of Google Glass reflecting this sort of colonial surveillance project. So another dimension of this is the internet and specifically social media or forms of 2.0 communicative forms of internet communication and community. So we're going to look at it here in week 13 in the context of the internet. So, and our two articles this week by Christian Fuchs, The Critique of the Political Economy of Web 2.0 Surveillance, and Trottier and Lyon, Key Features of Social Media Surveillance. So we'll dive in and have a close look at these readings and see if we can dig out the salient issues for us this week. So Christian Fuchs focuses on Google Buzz and Facebook as the kind of two examples of Web 2.0 surveillance. So we'll take a look at these two examples, and as we'll see, the structures are quite similar, and it's very transferable across these different social media sites. There's a lot of sharing of the kind of features that we're going to be talking about. So I don't think this is specifically about Facebook and Google Buzz, but there's a lot of crossover with other social media sites using similar tools to really collect information and target advertising to their customer base. So as Fuchs points out, Google Buzz is part of Google's empire of economic surveillance. It gathers information about user behavior and user interests in order to store, assess, and sell this data to advertising clients. So a lot of the information it gathers is things people will probably be aware of, things like the information on the profile and age, date of birth, that sort of thing. But of course, there's a whole host of other things that come from the way users share information with each other, and users develop these cross ties with each other that is very valuable to advertising clients, which again, users of the site might not necessarily be aware of these ways in which their information is being used, or the extent to which profiles about them are being developed by the social media sites they're using, including Facebook and Google Buzz. And the privacy policies of companies like Google and Facebook often try to disguise and cover up the fact that the company relies on capturing and selling quantities of market data. So the privacy policy is not an effort to be transparent about the way that data is being used. It often tries to disguise the way that the data is being used, and uses a number of euphemisms, words that make it seem like there's something very transparent and very innocuous going on, when in fact, when you look below the surface, there are more insidious things that are taking place, which users again are not made aware of, and you have to do a lot of digging, a lot of background research, and gather a lot of information in order to find out how the information is actually being used. So Facebook's policy uses this euphemism of sharing information with third parties to downplay the many ways it commodifies user data and data generated from user behavior on the site. So the ways that users link with each other, the way they develop community with each other, a lot of that can be commodified, a lot of that can be rendered as data to third parties. So the Facebook tries to kind of downplay the way that sharing, that giving of information to third parties is taking place, and uses these kind of innocuous terms like sharing to to disguise the commodification of their information, the selling of their information, and the way their behavior on the site is rendered in economic terms for marketing purposes. As Fuchs points out, Facebook reduces the issue of privacy to controlling the visibility of user information to other users, and neglects the issue of control of advertising settings as a fundamental privacy issue. So it's the visibility to other users which is prioritized by Facebook. In other words, the one-to-one communal ties that users have with other users whom they've developed a connection. And it tends not to emphasize and talk about the advertising settings which determine how much information is actually sent to advertisers, how much of a user's information is commodified, and so on. So it gives a misleading impression about privacy, and a misleading impression about the way that users' information is taken and developed and exploited and marketed. And this was came to the fore really in March of 2019, when Facebook tried to revamp its targeted ad system to prevent discrimination. And in fact, it was forced to do this because of a legal settlement in which its ads on housing, jobs and credit had been seen as discriminatory. So individuals were using housing ads to appeal to particular segments of the population with a kind of racial bias. Same in jobs and credit ads. So these kind of practices, which allowed people to sort of do targeted discrimination. Facebook was the object of a legal case which it lost, and it made a commitment in March of 2019 to revamp these practices and to make an effort to no longer discriminate in these kinds of ways. So, as Fuchs points out, the changes to Facebook's advertising methods, which generate most of the company's profits, are unprecedented. The social network says it will no longer allow housing, employment, or credit ads that target people by age, gender, or zip code. And of course, the kind of zip code part is where the racial focus comes in, with people being heavily sort of racially differentiated in the United States according to their zip code. So Facebook will also limit other targeting options, so these ads don't exclude people on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, and other legally protected categories, which obviously includes national origin and sexual orientation as well. So by doing these ads and sort of targeting people by age and gender and zip code, marketers on Facebook were able to violate these prescriptions against the exclusion of people on the basis of race and ethnicity and sexual orientation and other protected categories. And Facebook has kind of made a commitment that it would no longer allow that kind of targeting in these kinds of ways. So this is kind of symptomatic of the way that the targeting features on Facebook, the way of sort of segmenting populations, can allow these kind of insidious practices to develop, which people have attempted to outlaw by in a sort of offline setting by legal means, but with sort of Facebook's the kind of data available on Facebook for marketers, these methods can become prevalent again in an online setting. This is a worrying development, but encouraging that Facebook lost the case and now has to change its practices on this basis. So Fuchs talks about this idea of surveillance, this connection between surveillance and capitalism, and argues that there's an antagonism between privacy ideals and surveillance, which is constitutive for capitalism itself. And three features of the modern world, the modern capitalist world, drive this antagonism between surveillance and this between privacy ideals and surveillance. So there's this conflict in the modern world that drives this antagonism. And let's look at these three features that Fuchs points at. So the first issue is trust. So since we're no longer a kind of tightly bound community, but a very dispersed, very large society, strangers constantly enter into economic exchanges with each other. And this raises the issue of trust, whether strangers can be trusted. And this is often established with different surveillance procedures, which establish a kind of trust that can then be used to establish a connection going forward. So it solves this problem of how do you trust people. And of course, surveillance in itself is a kind of lack of trust, but the kind of presence of surveillance or the use of it gives people a certain confidence, I guess, that they're not going to be exploited. So that's one sort of driver of the use of surveillance procedures. A second driver for Fuchs is socioeconomic differences, which pose problems for the maintenance of order and the private ownership of wealth, and leads to the phenomena of crime, political protests, and in rarer cases, violent conflicts. So state surveillance has become a feature of the contemporary world for this purpose, and not just state surveillance, but private surveillance as well. Think of the immense sums of money spent on sort of developing private communities, and then having kind of surveillance and sort of guard systems and different things to protect private communities. So all of these, so socioeconomic differences create this motivation and this need for vast sums of money to be spent on protecting the sort of private accumulations of wealth. So people build private communities and then surveil those communities to prevent outsiders from coming in. So clearly another big driver of surveillance are the massive socioeconomic differences in society and the way they lead to this sense of insecurity, and that drives a desire for surveillance to keep out people who may be seen as threatening or outsiders for whatever reasons. And the third is that corporations driven by profit have an interest in knowing as much as possible about people's interests, tastes, and behaviors, resulting in the constant surveillance of consumers. And this is the one that really drives social media surveillance in this case, is about this interest of corporations in finding information about people, in knowing deeply about their tastes and interests and their behaviors. And so surveillance is driven by this interest in profit, which requires knowledge about consumers. And of course, that's always been a feature of corporations and marketing, to sort of find out about consumers and where they are and what they're interested in. It's just as people spend more time on social media, it's become one of the kind of main sources of gathering that information, marketing it, and making it available to third parties for a price. And of course, that's become the kind of the viable kind of corporate model of social media companies, that they sell user information that's developed from users sort of using the site and interacting with each other, and the selling of targeted information to advertisers so that the advertisers can then target those users, has become the kind of the profit model that social media in general have developed. So Web 2.0 is characterized by what Fuchs calls mass self-surveillance. And the idea here is that users help to produce surveillance by providing user-generated content that is gathered en masse and used by companies to sell targeted advertisements. So the users here are actively productive in providing and generating that content. They're not sort of the passive victims of surveillance. It's almost like they are sort of creating the material that's going to be used to target them, and sort of co-producing the surveillance itself. So there's a sort of participation of users in the entire process of developing the information itself. So, as Fuchs points out, the highly concentrated ownership structure of Web 2.0 companies and the singular focus of those companies on accumulating capital and profit for its owners means that Web 2.0 does nothing to extend democracy or promote human development. So we've talked about these kind of struggles around the internet, whether it's going to be used to promote forms of community, whether it's a kind of corporate space that's a kind of used for primarily for shopping and consuming, or whether it has these kind of communal democratic features. People form groups based on common interests and can then sort of have a social political identity. So the users of the platforms are seen by owners as a commodity to be sold by advertisers, to be sold to advertisers. Sorry. So there's no pretense in these Web 2.0 platforms themselves that there's a promotion of democracy, or that there's a sort of promotion of human skills and human development and self-expression. At least what there is, it's very easy to see past that and to see that the user information is being sort of gathered and vacuumed up en masse and sold as a commodity to advertisers. So, and this is the kind of participatory nature of Web 2.0 that Fuchs talks about, that the users of Web 2.0 are often content producers. So the users engage in creative activity, communication, and building community with each other. And the word Fuchs uses for this is he says they are prosumers, so it's like they are productive. At the same time as being consumers, so they have these creative and also sort of consumer features at the same time. So, but of course this takes place within a system that totally commodifies human creativity, meaning that the content drives profits for a very small number of owners of capital. So that sort of commodification and the way that the content is used to drive profits means that it's very different from a kind of framework that would be used to drive community and democracy and so on. So as Fuchs sums up here, surveillance, he argues, is a negative rather than a neutral thing. And this, he says on page 62, that surveillance is a specific kind of information gathering that involves potential or actual harm, coercion, violence, asymmetric power relations, control, manipulation, domination, or disciplinary power. It is instrumental and a means for trying to derive or accumulate benefits for certain groups or individuals at the expense of other groups or individuals. Excuse me. So in the case of social media, of course, it's a very small number of owners who are sort of benefiting from the site in terms of monetizing individuals' information and selling it and making that information available to third parties. There's a small number of people that sort of benefit from that, and everybody else is sort of participating as a prosumer, as somebody who develops content that is then sort of marketed and used to target them and their interests and their needs and so on. And we talked a little bit about the asymmetric power relations in the case of Google Glass, which we talked about as a kind of class project that embodied these asymmetrical class relations, with Google a kind of tech company in San Francisco, but sort of inserting itself into these poorer neighborhoods. So a very, a sort of, and always with surveillance, there's this kind of asymmetry between the watchers and the watched, and there's no, whoever's on one side of that division is potentially involved in a kind of coercion or control or manipulation of people on the other side of the division. So I think Fuchs is correct to say that there's that this asymmetric power relation is the core of what surveillance is, and of course from that power relation there flows the always potential possibility of that developing into a kind of control, manipulation, domination, or a kind of disciplinary power. All right, let's take a look at some ideas in Trottier and Lyon. And we'll start with this idea of liquid surveillance. And liquid surveillance refers to a world in which social forms and institutions are malleable and constantly changing. And there are two aspects where we can see this, that social media sites are constantly mutating as users cooperate to develop new forms of contact and identity construction. So they're liquid in the sense of a constant sort of change of these institutions. They're not sort of stable in one form, but capable of sort of mutating and changing according to how users develop new forms of interacting. And identity itself becomes more liquid as a result of the multiple opportunities for defining and situating oneself. So again, as an individual, you can situate yourself in social media in these various contexts, leading to a kind of liquid sense of identity about the sort of flow of the real me between these different sites, leading to a more liquid sense of identity itself. So Trottier and Lyon talk about this idea of collaborative identity construction, and we were just talking about this with Fuchs as well, and the idea of users being prosumers, that social media users work together here to construct each other's identity through various forms of sharing. So here it's the kind of the collective moment where individuals construct each other's identity and sort of collaborate in that identity construction online. Examples from Facebook, again, the walls on user profiles, uploading photographs and tagging people, leaving comments on photos or whatever are ways that users in a network collaborate to sort of construct the identity of other people in that network. And lateral ties, of course, become very important. Individuals upload information on Facebook and other sites with a view to maintaining relationships with a personal network of friends. So this leads to a degree of comfort with uploading personal information, given that the target audience are a kind of personal network. However, of course, these social ties are visible excuse me, and can be used to gather information about an individual involved in this network. So a sort of a typical example that comes up here with a gay person who may not be completely out with in a particular context, but of course looking at the kind of social ties that they develop, the institutions they're affiliated with, you could sort of have a context in which a gay person is out in a context, in a sort of online context where you can see it, and of course that might be transferred to other contexts where it's not so explicit. Maybe it's not part of the identity in these other sort of sites, these other ties. But of course, since the ties themselves are visible, that information itself can be gathered about an individual, and it can lead to certain types of targeting based on the kind of network that the individual is involved with. Certain types of targeting can be directed, even though it's not explicit in all the networks, or it's an inference about who the individual associates with, more than something that's explicitly said. But these social ties, these lateral ties, have become an important source of information about users of social media. And of course, this is directly related to the idea of leaks. And by design, information tied to a particular context can easily migrate elsewhere. As we were just saying, you may have an aspect of your identity in one context which is not prevalent in another context, or maybe which is hidden or disguised in another context. But typically, sites tend to privilege the leakage of information, the kind of migrating of information from one context to another. So information that's presented on user profiles is assessed on can be assessed in several different contexts. So the user profile can be seen maybe by the individual themselves as a sort of personal diary, but for everybody who sort of doesn't know that person in an explicitly personal way, that will be seen as a kind of public broadcast of who that person is. So context can lead to, information being sort of presented in different ways and migrating into different contexts where it wasn't sort of intended to be presented. Okay, let's talk about a couple of conclusions here as we think about summing up. So Fuchs' criticisms of Web 2.0 corporations, as we saw, they're very highly concentrated ownership, focused solely on profit. And so he criticizes them for failing to extend democracy and citizen participation. And this recalls one of our main themes in this class. We talked about this in the first part of the course, the social constructionist idea of a struggle between different social groups for power to set the terms of online communication and community. And we talked of Feinberg's idea of the internet as sort of reflecting this struggle between, between the idea of a kind of marketplace where people are consumers, passive consumers buying things, or the idea of a kind of community where individuals are kind of getting together with each other and forming networks. And so what we see with these sort of social media, these what Fuchs calls these Web 2.0 corporations, but largely these sort of social media companies that focus on getting people's attention, is that that struggle seems to be reflected in the way they work, that they embody these features of this sort of internet as a marketplace, in their sort of focus on profit and targeted, the sort of focus on selling user data. But at the same time, they embody some of these sort of features of community, in the way users form different groups together, and they're able to use those groups in different ways to further their interests and so on. But whether then we can say whether it's a mixed message here, or whether like Fuchs we want to be like him, we sort of pessimistic about where this is going and the extent to which democracy is sort of really being promoted here, given the sort of overarching setting of sort of commodification and exploitation of individuals' data for targeted advertising. So that's something we've been talking about it a lot, and I think the social media situation shows us that struggle is an ongoing one and is going to be an ongoing struggle in coming years, and is probably going to be fought partially in terms of public decisions about how to control and police these corporations like Facebook that have immense power to sort of drive social discourse. All right, so the second thing, Trottier and Lyon emphasize the dual liquid nature of social media surveillance. It requires collaboration in identity construction of the participants themselves, which can often feel voluntary and empowering, which is why individuals keep going back to it and feel that they're kind of constructing their identity and feeling empowered in doing so. But at the same time, the information allows individuals to be sorted and exposed to commodification and marketing. So the information they provide and the networks they construct are used by companies to sort them into specific groups which are targeted in specific ways. So we always have, and we come back to this division between surveillance, the watchers, and the watched. And individuals are kind of blind to the ways that their information is being kind of used and exploited and developed in these ways that's going to allow targeted advertising based on the way they define themselves. So that they're always kind of on the outside of that process. So it reflects that kind of that dual nature of surveillance again, and the fact that participants are subject to this kind of this level of kind of discipline and control that really makes this sense of the voluntary and empowering nature of it seem a bit false.